The cellar reeked of damp stone and desperation. Myra's fingers were raw from scrubbing the mold from between the bricks, her knees permanently bruised from kneeling on the unforgiving floor. Shadows pooled in the corners like living things, watching her with malevolent patience. She'd learned not to flinch at the darkness anymore. 3 months. It had been 3 months since Vasilis Crane dragged her away from the marketplace, since she'd last felt sunlight on her skin or heard her mother's voice without the filter of pain. 3 months of bondage, of threats whispered like poetry, of watching her sister's eyes die a little more each day in the adjacent cell. Your mother will die if you fail. Crane's voice echoed through her mind constantly, a plague of words she couldn't escape. And your sister, beautiful little Ella, she'll wish for death long before it comes. He'd made sure she understood the stakes. He'd made sure she understood that he was patient, that he could wait forever, and that the cost of defiance was measured in the suffering of those she loved most. Vasilis Crane was a werewolf lord of tremendous power, and he'd chosen her for a single purpose: to become a servant in King Alexander's household, to work in his chambers, to poison him. There's a rare herb, Crane had explained, his fingers trailing across her collarbone in a gesture that made her skin crawl. It grows only in the northern wastes. A single drop in his evening wine will paralyze him completely within hours. By dawn, he'll be dead, and no one will know it was murder. A sudden illness, they'll say. A tragedy. Mira had memorized everything. The appearance of the herb, silver leaves that seemed to catch light impossibly, the exact amount needed, the fact that Crane would send her 1 vial through the servant network every week, hidden in flour sacks and laundry bundles. The moment she succeeded, her mother and sister would be released. She had to believe that. If she didn't, she'd lose her mind entirely. The day she entered King Alexander's palace, Mira had felt like a woman walking toward her own execution. The great halls were vast and cold, filled with servants who scurried about their duties with practiced efficiency. She'd been assigned to the private chambers of the king himself, a position of trust that felt like a noose tightening around her neck. Alexander Thorne was not what she'd expected. She'd heard the stories, of course. Everyone had. The Alpha King who united the fractured werewolf territories through cunning and ruthlessness. The man who'd orchestrated the downfall of 3 rival packs in a single winter. The predator who could smell weakness like blood in water. She expected a monster. What she found instead was something far more dangerous. A man. He was tall, with the kind of presence that made rooms compress around him. His hair was dark as midnight, his eyes a sharp silver that seemed to see through the carefully constructed walls she'd built. When he looked at her that first morning, she'd felt her carefully prepared persona crack like thin ice. "What's your name?" he'd asked, not unkindly, though there was an edge beneath the words, something that made the fur on the back of her neck stand on end despite her human form. "Mira, my lord," she'd said, her voice steady through sheer force of will. "I'm here to serve." For a long moment, he'd studied her. She could feel him cataloging her, reading her like a book written in fear and determination. "You're terrified," he'd observed, and it wasn't cruelty in his tone, just fact. "I'm new, my lord," she'd replied, deflecting with practiced ease. "I want to do well." He'd turned away, returning to the documents spread across his desk, and she'd released a breath she hadn't known she was holding. But as she went about her duties, straightening his chambers, preparing his workspace, fetching his breakfast, she'd felt his attention on her like weight. That had been 4 weeks ago. 4 weeks of serving the man she was supposed to kill. 4 weeks of getting to know the small details of his life, that he took his tea with honey, that he read for hours before dawn, that he had a scar along his ribs that he never spoke about, that he sometimes stopped mid-sentence and stared out the window with an expression of such profound loneliness it made her chest ache. For weeks of watching him conduct the business of a kingdom, of witnessing his intelligence and the careful consideration he gave decisions that affected thousands of lives. The first vial of poison had arrived in a flour sack 2 weeks into her employment. She found it hidden in the kitchen, wrapped in cloth with a note in Crane's handwriting. "Your sister screamed your name yesterday. It was beautiful. Make sure you use this." She'd held that vial in her trembling fingers and felt her soul fracture into 1,000 pieces. Every night, She placed it on her shelf in the servants' quarters and stared at it. Every morning, she thought of ways to do it. She could dissolve it in his wine. She could smear it on the handle of his sword. She could slip it into his food. The opportunities were endless, and her window was closing. Crane had sent word to the underground network of servants. The king was attending a diplomatic summit in 2 weeks. After that, the household would be in chaos, reorganizing, and her position would be compromised. She had to act before then, but she'd done nothing. Instead, she'd watched him sit at his desk and write letters to his mother, who lived in a tower in the eastern province. Letters filled with a tenderness that didn't match his reputation. She'd watch him refuse to attend a social gathering because he felt a migraine coming on, staying in his chambers instead, and asking for nothing, not wanting to trouble anyone. She'd watched him personally visit the households of guards who'd been injured in a border skirmish, ensuring their families were cared for. She'd also watched him sparring in the courtyard one dawn when she'd woken early, his shirt discarded, his muscled body moving with lethal grace, his focus absolute. And she'd felt something stir in her chest that she had no right to feel. Crane called every 3 days through a servant he'd planted in the palace kitchens. She'd recognize the signal, a specific way of folding a cloth, and would meet the woman in the storage room for updates. "Your mother asked for you," the servant would whisper, and each time it was like a blade through Myra's heart. "Your sister won't eat." The cruelty of it was exquisite. Crane was using love as a weapon, and it was far more effective than any chain. She made a decision then, a decision that crystallized in her mind over the past few days. She would do it. She would poison the king. Tonight, he'd asked for dinner in his chambers, unusual but not unheard of, and she'd prepare his wine herself. 1 drop of the poison. That's all it would take. By morning, he'd be dead, and her mother and sister would be free. She repeated it like a mantra, trying to convince herself that the hollow ache in her chest was worth it, that justice could be served through her own hands, even if it meant becoming a murderer. The evening came too quickly, and not quickly enough. She prepared his meal with exquisite care. Roasted meat, fresh vegetables, bread still warm from the oven. Everything perfect. Everything exactly as he liked it. She'd laid out his dining table in his sitting room, watching the last light of day paint the sky in shades of amber and purple. And then she retrieved the vial from her quarters, her hands shaking so badly she could barely open it. 1 drop, just 1 drop in the wine. She held it over the goblet, watching the liquid inside catch the light. Behind her, she could hear his footsteps approaching. He was coming to dine, to sit and eat the food she prepared, and drink the poison she was about to administer. Her vision blurred, her eyes stung with tears she couldn't shed. This was what monsters did, she thought distantly. They became other monsters to save the people they loved. They traded their souls on the darkest of markets and pretended it was a fair price. They looked in mirrors and didn't recognize themselves anymore. "Mira?" She spun around, the vial still in her hand, and found him standing in the doorway of his chambers. He was still dressed in his day clothes, dark trousers and a linen shirt, his silver eyes sharp with curiosity and concern. "Is something amiss?" he asked, moving into the room with that predatory grace that was both beautiful and terrifying. Her heart hammered against her ribs, so hard she thought it might break through bone. "No, my lord, everything is prepared as you requested." His eyes tracked to her hand, to the small vial she was still clutching. She watched his expression shift, a flicker of something like understanding passing through his features. His nostrils flared slightly, and she realized he was scenting her fear and her desperation, and the poison that had to reek of magic and wrongness to his enhanced senses. "What is that?" he asked quietly. There was a moment, a suspended instant in time, where she could have lied, could have hidden away and tried again another night. Instead, something in her broke open. "It's poison," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "For you." She expected him to move, to shift into his wolf form, to kill her as she surely deserved. But he didn't. He simply stood there, watching her with those impossible silver eyes, and asked, "Why?" The question was so simple, and yet it contained multitudes. She found herself answering truthfully, months of carefully constructed lies crumbling away like sand. Because they have my mother and my sister. Vasilis Crane took them from me 3 months ago and said he'd kill them if I didn't. The words came out in a rush, a dam breaking. He said if I poisoned you, if I killed the Alpha King, he'd let them go. He said he'd release them and disappear, and we could have our lives back. The king's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his gaze, something that might have been pain or rage, or both. "Do you want to kill me?" he asked. "No," she said, and it was the most honest thing she'd ever said. "I don't. I've tried to convince myself that I should, that it was worth it, that any price was acceptable if it meant saving them. But when it came to it," she looked down at the vial in her shaking hand. I can't kill you." "And if you don't?" he asked, stepping closer. He wasn't threatening. His body language was open, calm, but she could feel the coiled power beneath the stillness. "What happens to your family?" "Then they die," she whispered. "Or Crane finds another use for them, and they'll wish they had." The king took the vial from her unresisting fingers and held it up to the lamplight. For a long moment, he was silent, studying the swirling liquid inside. Then he set it carefully on the table beside the wine. "Tell me everything," he said, "and don't leave anything out." So she did. She told him about the marketplace, about the day Crane had taken her. She described the cellar, the threats, the careful cruelty of a man who understood exactly how to break a person without leaving visible marks. She told him about Ella, about her mother, about the whispered messages and the slow death of hope. He listened without interrupting, his face a mask of stone, his eyes burning with intensity that made her think of wildfire. When she finished, when there was nothing left to say, he was quiet for a long time. "Where are they being held?" he finally asked. "An estate in the western marshes. 3 days' ride from here. I don't know the exact location, only that it's hidden, warded. Crane has magic users. Real ones, not like me. He's built something dark there." The king nodded slowly. Then he did something that broke her entirely. He reached out and cupped her face gently in his hand. His thumb traced the high arch of her cheekbone with surprising tenderness. "You chose not to kill me," he said softly, "even knowing the cost, even knowing what you might lose. Do you understand what that makes you?" "It makes me a failure," she said. "It makes me selfish. It makes you good," he interrupted, and there was something fierce in his voice now, something that made her knees weak. "It makes you better than the monster they try to turn you into." She looked up at him, and in that moment, standing in his private chambers with the poison still resting on the table between them, something shifted in the architecture of her world. She'd expected cruelty from a king. She'd expected punishment. What she found instead was a man who saw her, truly saw her, and didn't turn away in disgust. "What will you do?" she asked. He dropped his hand from her face and moved to the window, his silhouette outlined against the dying light. When he spoke, his voice was low and dangerous, carrying with it the weight of command. "I'm going to do what I should have done the moment Vasilis Crane decided to play games with my kingdom," he said. "I'm going to burn him to ash, and I'm going to bring your family home." He turned back to face her, and in that moment, Mira caught her first true glimpse of the legendary Alpha King, the man who'd united the fractured territories, the predator who could see in darkness. He was beautiful and terrible and absolutely immovable. "But first," he said, extending his hand to her, "you're going to tell me everything you know about the marshes, about Crane's defenses, about the people he has working for him, and then you're going to help me dismantle his empire piece by piece." She reached out slowly and placed her hand in his. The moment their skin touched, she felt it, a spark of something that transcended the purely physical, a recognition that seemed to resonate in her bones. "Why would you trust me?" she asked. "I came here to kill you." He pulled her close, his other hand settling on the small of her back, anchoring her to him. "Because you didn't," he said simply, "and because I can smell the truth on you. You were never meant to be his weapon, Mira. That took courage I'm not sure you realize you possess." As night fell fully over the palace, and the stars emerged like diamonds scattered across velvet, Mira found herself standing in the arms of the man she'd been sent to murder. And for the first time in 3 months, something that felt dangerously like hope kindled in her chest. The planning room was sparse and functional, located deep within the palace where few were allowed to venture. Alexander had summoned his war council, the inner circle of advisor generals and magic users who'd helped him build and maintain his kingdom. Mira sat at the edge of the room, feeling out of place among these powerful beings, yet Alexander had insisted she be present. "We strike in 3 days," he said, his voice carrying the absolute authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. Crane has grown complacent. He believed the girl is either dead or committed to his cause. He won't expect an assault. Mira listened as they discussed tactics, troop movements, the positioning of their most powerful magic users. She provided what intelligence she could, the layout of the estate as she remembered from the few times she glimpsed it through windows, the names of the servants she knew were loyal to Crane, the schedule of his movements. What struck her most was how quickly Alexander had mobilized. There was no hesitation, no deliberation about whether saving her family was worth the risk to his kingdom. It was simply decided. By sunset tomorrow, forces would be in motion. By nightfall, war would come to the western marshes. That night, as she retreated to her chambers, no longer a servant's small room, but a guest chamber near the royal quarters, a position that had caused no small amount of gossip among the household staff, she found him waiting for her. He stood at her window, looking out into the darkness, his hands clasped behind his back. "My lord," she said, curtsying out of habit. He turned to face her, and she saw the weight of kingship written across his features. Being alpha meant carrying the burden of every soul under your protection. It meant making decisions that would echo through generations. It meant being willing to sacrifice everything, including yourself. "Are you afraid?" he asked. "Terrified," she admitted. "What if this goes wrong? What if Crane—" "He won't." Alexander's voice was absolute. "I've spent years building alliances, training warriors, cultivating magic users who'd follow me to the ends of the earth. Crane is powerful, yes, but he's isolated himself. He thinks fear is the ultimate weapon. He doesn't understand that loyalty, true loyalty born not from terror but from shared purpose, is infinitely stronger." He moved toward her, each step deliberate. "I've sent scouts ahead. Your mother and sister are alive. Crane has been keeping them in decent conditions, not comfortable, but not tortured beyond measure. He needed them as leverage over you, which means he'd keep them breathing. When dawn comes 3 days hence, they will be freed." The certainty in his voice, the absolute conviction that what he said would come to pass, made her throat tight. She wanted to believe him. She needed to believe him. But she'd learned that hope was a luxury for people who hadn't had it systematically stripped away. "And what about after?" she asked quietly. "After you rescue them? What happens to me?" Alexander reached out and took her hand, pulling her to sit beside him on the edge of her bed. In the dimness of the chamber, illuminated only by moonlight filtering through the windows, he looked almost vulnerable, almost human, rather than the terrible, beautiful force of nature she knew him to be. "That," he said, "depends on what you want. I don't understand." "You could leave," he said, and there was something like pain in his voice. "Take your family somewhere safe, somewhere far from power and politics and dangerous men like me. Build a quiet life. Forget about this place. Forget about me. I would make sure you had enough resources to live comfortably for 100 years. You would be free, Mira, truly free." She waited, because she sensed there was more. "Or," he continued, his silver eyes finding hers in the darkness, "you could stay." "Stay." She couldn't imagine what he meant. "Stay as what? Your servant? She couldn't finish the thought. "As whatever you choose to be," he said. "A counselor, if you wanted. You have a keen mind. I've watched you work through problems, seen how you think. You could advise me on matters of state. Or you could simply exist in my world, and I would make it my business to ensure that you never wanted for anything, that you were never afraid again." Mira felt tears prick at her eyes. This wasn't the romantic fantasy she'd read about in hidden books. Wasn't a simple love story of heroines and tales. This was darker, more complicated. Alexander was asking her to bind herself to a man who wielded power like a weapon, who commanded armies and bent kingdoms to his will. He was asking her to trust him when trust had been weaponized against her. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you want me to stay? You don't know me." "I know enough," he said. "I know you have a heart so fierce it was willing to sacrifice itself for people you love. I know you chose conscience over survival when faced with an impossible choice. I know that when you look at me, you don't see the Alpha King or the legend. You see a man, just a man, and that's worth more to me than I can express." He reached up and brushed a tear from her cheek with surprising tenderness. "And if I'm being honest," he continued, his voice roughening slightly, "I know that I've spent 5 years alone at the top of this mountain I built, and the moment you walked into my chambers with genuine fear in your eyes and poison in your hand, something in me recognized something in you. A kindred spirit, another broken thing trying to survive in a brutal world." Mira leaned into his touch, closing her eyes. She thought of her mother, of Ella, of the years of pain and terror and helplessness. She thought of the vial of poison and the choice she'd made. She thought of standing alone against an impossible situation and somehow, through sheer force of will, refusing to be remade into a weapon. "I can't promise I won't be afraid," she said softly. "I can't promise that what I feel won't be clouded by trauma and gratitude and a desperate need for safety." "I'm not asking for promises," Alexander said. "I'm asking only that you give yourself permission to find out who you are when you're not running, not hiding, not surviving. That you let me help with that. That you let me stand beside you while you become whoever you're meant to be." He drew her close then, and she rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart. Outside her window, the night was vast and full of stars, and somewhere in the darkness, her family was waiting to be saved. Somewhere in this complicated, terrifying moment, Mira made a choice, not to flee, not to remain a victim or a weapon, but to step forward into uncertainty with a man who saw her as something precious rather than something broken. It was the most dangerous decision she'd ever made, more dangerous even than the poison. 3 days, she said, her voice muffled against his chest. 3 days, he confirmed, his hand stroking her hair gently. And then everything changes. That night, she slept in his presence without fear. For the first time in more than 3 months, Mira slept like someone who finally found solid ground in an ocean of chaos. And in the darkness of her chamber, the Alpha King watched over her, like a man guarding something irreplaceable. The night before the assault, Mira couldn't sleep. She'd tried, had genuinely attempted to rest, knowing that tomorrow would test her in ways she couldn't predict. But her mind would not settle. It raced with possibilities, with fears both rational and imagined, with the weight of 3 days of waiting compressed into endless hours. She rose before dawn and dressed in the practical clothes Alexander had provided. Leather breeches and a fitted tunic, nothing like the maid's dress she'd worn for weeks. She looked like someone ready for battle, even though her only battle would be internal. The courtyard was already bustling when she made her way down. Soldiers moved with practiced efficiency, checking weapons, securing supplies onto horses that stamped and nickered with the nervous energy of animals sensing what was coming. The sky was still dark, but it was a darkness that preceded dawn, full of promise and dread in equal measure. She found Alexander near the stables, dressed in fitted black leather armor that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Over his shoulder was slung a massive sword that looked like it had seen centuries of battles. He looked every inch the predator, the warrior king, the force of nature that had unified the fractured territories. When he saw her, something in his expression softened. He handed off instructions to one of his generals and crossed the courtyard to her, his movement fluid and inevitable as gravity. "You should be resting," he said, not unkindly. "So should you," she replied. "But we both know neither of us will." A faint smile curved his lips. "No, I suppose we won't." He took her hand, leading her away from the bustle toward a quieter corner of the courtyard, where shadows still pooled thick and deep. "I wanted to speak with you before we leave. What if something goes wrong?" The question escaped before she could stop it. What if Crane has moved them? What if he set a trap? "Then we adapt," Alexander said simply. "War is never what you plan for. But Crane is arrogant. He's convinced himself that he has all the time in the world because you're either dead or completely subdued by now. He won't have anticipated this level of response. And I have something he doesn't. What's that? I have nothing left to lose in this fight except you, he said, and there was something bone deep in his voice, a certainty that bordered on obsession. That makes me infinitely more dangerous than he could ever be. Mira looked at this man who'd taken her fragmented story and turned it into action, who'd mobilized his entire kingdom to save people he'd never met simply because she'd asked, or rather, because she'd been unable to ask, and he'd offered anyway. In the pale pre-dawn light, she could see the exhaustion written into lines of his face, the weight of command that never truly left even in moments of relative peace. I'm afraid, she said quietly, not of Crane, not even of death. I'm afraid that I'm going to feel grateful to you in ways that will destroy me, that I'll confuse rescue with love, and bind myself to you out of desperation rather than choice, and that when the gratitude fades, I'll realize I've trapped myself with another kind of cage. Alexander was silent for a long moment. Then he reached out and tilted her chin up, so she had to meet his gaze. That's a fair fear, he said, one I've thought about myself. So I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to answer with absolute honesty. When you look at me, beyond the king, beyond the warrior, beyond the man who's saving your family, do you see someone you could want to know? Someone you could choose, not out of obligation, but out of genuine interest? Myra's heart hammered in her chest. It would be so easy to lie, to give him the answer he wanted to hear. But she'd sworn to herself that she would never again trade truth for comfort. I don't know, she said, and watched him flinch slightly at the honesty. I see someone who frightens me and fascinates me in equal measure. I see someone capable of incredible cruelty and incredible kindness. I see someone who spent so long at the top of that mountain you built that connection feels like weakness to you. I don't know if I can navigate that, or if I should even try. For a heartbeat, she thought she'd made a terrible mistake. She thought she destroyed whatever fragile thing was building between them with her refusal to offer false comfort. Then Alexander pulled her into an embrace, pressing his lips to the top of her head. Thank you, he said softly. Thank you for not lying to me. You're welcome, she whispered, confused and terrified and utterly undone. I'm going to bring your family home, he said, not as a gift, not as a path to obligating you to me, but because it's the right thing and because I can. And then I'm going to step back, and I'm going to let you choose. No pressure, no strings, no hidden expectation of gratitude. You can leave, you can stay, you can spend years figuring out what you want. I don't care. I just need you to be free. She pulled back to look at him, searching his face for signs of deception and finding none. That's not how power works, she said. That's not how people like you work. No, he agreed. It's not. But perhaps I'm tired of being only what power demands I be. Perhaps I want to be better than that. Before she could respond, a horn sounded, the signal to mount up, to prepare for departure. Alexander squeezed her hand once more and then moved away, becoming the Alpha King once more as he commanded his forces with sharp, efficient orders. Mira watched him transform before her eyes, watched the vulnerable man disappear beneath layers of command and control. She understood then that this was the cost of loving someone like him, accepting that he would always be pulled in 100 directions by duty and obligation, that she would always be secondary to the needs of his kingdom. Understanding that didn't make it any easier. The ride to the western marshes took 3 days as predicted, and they were 3 days of tension that stretched taut as wire. Mira rode near the center of the column, surrounded by guards under Alexander's explicit orders. She caught glimpses of him at the front of the procession, his dark figure unmistakable, his attention always on the landscape ahead, reading dangers she couldn't see. They moved through forests and across open plains, and the farther they traveled from the palace, the more Mira felt the weight of her trauma pressing down. She was riding toward the place where her mother and sister were imprisoned, toward a confrontation with the man who'd broken her. Her hand shook on her horse's reins, and more than once she had to fight back waves of nausea. On the evening of the second day, Alexander found her sitting alone near the camp's edge, staring into darkness. He settled beside her without asking permission, his presence solid and reassuring. I can feel your fear, he said. It wasn't a question. What if I'm not strong enough to face him? She asked. What if when I see Crane I fall apart? What if I somehow sabotage this because I'm too broken to be useful? Alexander reached over and took her trembling hand in his steady one. You will see him, he said with absolute certainty, and you will remember that you tried to kill a king to save your family. You will remember that you chose conscience over survival, and you will understand in that moment exactly how much strength you truly possess. Fear and strength aren't opposites. Mira, the bravest people I've ever known were terrified. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's action despite fear. How do you know that? She whispered. Because I was terrified when I first claimed the throne, he said quietly. I was terrified every single day for the first year, convinced that I'd made a catastrophic mistake that would destroy thousands of lives. I was terrified that I wasn't worthy of the power I held. But I did it anyway, and eventually the terror became something else. Purpose, direction, clarity. He released her hand and stood, offering her his arm. Come, we strike at dawn. You should eat something and try to rest. When dawn came on the third day, Mira was armed and ready despite every instinct screaming at her to flee. Alexander had insisted, and she'd agreed. She wore a short sword at her hip and carried a small dagger in her boot. It was unlikely she'd need them, but the weight of the weapons was somehow grounding. The estate loomed from a marsh like something out of a nightmare. It was built on an island of relatively solid ground, surrounded by treacherous water and floating vegetation. It had high walls and towers, and Mira could feel the wards that protected it. Dark magic that made her teeth ache and her skin crawl. There, she pointed to a section of wall on the eastern side. That's where they keep the prisoners. There's a window, very small, high up, but that's where my mother sleeps. I could see her sometimes when the clouds were right, and the light came through just so. Alexander studied the layout with the focus of a master strategist. Then he raised his hand, and his magic users moved into position. They were magnificent and terrible to behold. 4 of them, each with their own specialty. One specialized in breaking wards, one in stone and earth, one in transformation, one in battle itself, raw magical force given humanoid form. As the assault began, it was almost beautiful in its choreography. The ward breaker approached the walls and began to unravel the dark magic layer by layer, like deconstructing an intricate tapestry. Crane's forces, guards and mercenaries stationed on the walls, began to respond, arrows and magical attacks streaking out toward the royal force. But Alexander's magic users were beyond anything Crane could throw at them. The earthworker raised walls of stone to deflect attacks. The transformer created illusions that confused the defenders about where the actual assault was coming from. The battle magic user engaged directly with Crane's most powerful defenders. And through it all, Alexander moved like death itself. He shifted into his wolf form, a creature of terrifying beauty, massive and powerful and utterly savage. Mira watched as he tore through the estate's defenders with ferocity that was almost incomprehensible. This was what the legends meant when they spoke of the Alpha King. This was raw power in its most primal form. The battle was over in less than an hour. As the dust settled and the royal forces secured the grounds, Alexander shifted back to his human form. He was unharmed, though blood decorated his skin. Some his own, most decidedly not. He moved toward the main building with Mira following close behind, guards flanking them both. The interior of the estate was exactly as awful as she remembered. Dark stone corridors, torches that cast more shadow than light, the pervasive sense of suffering embedded into the very walls. Crane appeared before them in a central chamber, his face twisted with rage and disbelief. You came, he snarled at Mira. You actually came, as if you could somehow... His words cut off as Alexander moved between them, his body a physical barrier. Where are the prisoners? He demanded, his voice carrying all the weight of regal authority. They're dead, Crane spat. Killed them the moment I felt your forces approaching. If I can't have them as leverage, then no one will. He never finished. Alexander's hand closed around Crane's throat, and with a single fluid motion he twisted. The sound of bone breaking echoed through the chamber, and Vasilis Crane, The man who tortured Myra's family, who tried to weaponize her into a murderer, crumpled like a discarded puppet. Mira should have felt triumph, should have felt justice served, the monster defeated. Instead, she felt only a horrible, consuming dread. "The prisoners," she whispered urgently. "We have to find them." He was lying. He had to be lying. They found them in the lower levels, in cells that were marginally less horrific than the one Mira had been imprisoned in. Her mother was thin and pale, and her sister Ella was curled on a cot, barely responsive. But they were alive. Alive. Mira fell to her knees beside her mother, hardly able to breathe. Her mother's arms came around her, and they held each other while the world fell away. There were no words adequate to the moment. Nothing that could capture the relief, the gratitude, the terrible joy of reunion after so long believing they were lost. Alexander stood in the doorway, watching the scene with an expression she couldn't quite read. When she looked up and caught his eye, he nodded slowly and withdrew, giving them privacy. It took hours to get her family ready to travel. Ella had to be carried for the first part of the journey. Her mother was weak but determined, and Mira found herself supporting her as they made their way back to the royal encampment. The extent of her family's suffering became clearer with each passing mile. The damage that Crane had inflicted went far beyond the physical. That night, camped in the marshes with the estate burning behind them, Alexander had ordered it razed to the ground, every trace of Crane's dark work erased. Myra's mother pulled her aside. "What is he to you?" her mother asked quietly. "This king?" "I don't know," Mira admitted. "He saved you. He saved Ella. He saved me from becoming a murderer." "That's not what I asked," her mother said, studying her daughter with the keen eye of someone who lived long enough to understand human hearts. "What does he want from you?" "Supposedly nothing," Mira said. "He says I have a choice." "Do you believe him?" Mira was quiet for a long time, considering the question. "I think," she said slowly, "that he means it. But I also think that his definition of choice is inherently limited by who he is. He's alpha. He commands. Even when he's trying not to, the nature of his being makes it difficult for others to be truly free in his presence. It's like trying to choose your own path while standing in the shadow of a mountain." Her mother smiled sadly. "That's wisdom earned through pain," she said. "And I'm proud of you for seeing it so clearly. But Mira, I want you to know that gratitude is not an unworthy foundation for love. It's not the best foundation, perhaps, but it's not nothing. Sometimes people bond through shared suffering and rescue, and that bond becomes real and true in ways that initial passion never could." "How did you become so wise?" Mira asked, her throat tight. "By suffering," her mother said simply, "and by watching what suffering does to people and how they choose to become after." The return journey took another 3 days, and by the time the palace walls appeared on the horizon, Myra's entire world had shifted on its axis. Her family was safe. The man who tortured them was dead, and she was riding toward a future that was utterly uncertain. That night, after settling her mother and Ella into comfortable chambers with healers attending to their physical and emotional wounds, Mira found herself once again in Alexander's presence. They stood in his private study, and he looked exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical exertion. "They're safe," he said without preamble. "Your mother is recovering well. Your sister will take longer, but she has time now. Time to heal, time to rebuild. That's what I wanted to give you, time." "I know," Mira said. "I can see it. I can feel it in every kindness you show them, every comfort you ensure they have." "And," he prompted, watching her carefully. "And I don't know what comes next," she said honestly. "I don't know if I can love you, Alexander. I don't know if what I feel is genuine affection or just a desperate attachment of someone who's been saved from drowning. I don't know if I could ever be the kind of partner a king needs, someone equal to the burden of his station, someone who could stand beside him and not be diminished by a shadow." Alexander moved his window and looked out over his kingdom, the vast landscape of territories he'd united and territories he ruled. "I don't need an equal," he said quietly. "I've spent 5 years being the most powerful person in every room, and it's exhausting and lonely and ultimately hollow. What I need is someone real, someone genuine, someone who can stand before me and say things like what you just said rather than what they think I want to hear. He turned back to face her. So here's what I'm proposing. Stay. Not as a servant. Not as a guest. Stay as a member of my household, with all the privileges and comforts that entails. Live here. Build a life here. Let your family heal here. And perhaps, over time, your feelings will become clearer. Perhaps you'll discover that you do care for me, beyond gratitude. Or perhaps you'll realize that you don't. And when you're ready, I'll help you build a life elsewhere. And if I stay and never fall in love with you, Mira asked, if I remain a companion, a friend, but never more, then I will have been blessed with your presence, he said simply. And that will have to be enough. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to trust that a man with absolute power would genuinely accept a love that wasn't returned in full measure. But she also knew that humans were complicated creatures, prone to resentment and disappointment, prone to convincing themselves that their sacrifices entitled them to recompense. I'll stay, she said finally, but on one condition. Name it. That you allow me to work toward something, not sitting idle, not existing as decoration in your world. I want to contribute. I want to build my own sense of purpose and value independent of you or your gratitude toward me. Alexander smiled then, and it transformed his face. I think we can arrange that. In fact, I have a position in mind. My diplomatic corps could use someone with your insights into the minds of desperate people. Someone who understands what it means to be powerless and still choose righteousness. If you're interested, and despite everything, despite the fear, the uncertainty, the knowledge that she was binding herself to a complicated and powerful man in ways she didn't fully understand, Mira found herself smiling back. Yes, she said, I think I am. 6 months later, Mira stood in the great hall of the palace, dressed not in servant's clothes, but in the formal robes of the king's diplomatic advisor. She'd spent these months building a life that was genuinely hers, working with emissaries from the various territories, helping negotiate peace agreements, using her unique perspective to build bridges between factions that had previously seen each other as nothing but enemies. She'd also spent these months learning to live with her family again, working through the trauma and the damage that Crane had inflicted. Her mother had regained much of her strength, and Ella, though still struggling with the deeper emotional wounds, was slowly finding her way back to joy. But most unexpectedly, she'd spent these months falling slowly, inexorably in love with Alexander Thorne, the Alpha King. It hadn't happened with lightning bolt passion or sudden epiphany. It had happened quietly in small moments. In Wade asked her opinion on matters of state and genuinely listened to her response. In the way he defended her authority against nobles who questioned her position. In the way he'd shared his vulnerabilities with her, his doubts and fears, and the terrible weight of command. She was standing near a pillar, watching the grand ball that Alexander was hosting to celebrate new trade agreements, when he appeared at her side. You're not dancing, he observed. I'm observing, she replied. The negotiations between the Eastern territories are showing signs of strain. The delegation from the North is feeling sidelined. I'm trying to determine how to address it without creating further tension. He took her hand and pulled her toward the dance floor. Diplomacy can wait one evening, he said. Dance with me? They moved across the floor together, and Mira was struck by how natural it felt, as if they'd been dancing together for years rather than months. The ballroom swirled around them, a blur of colors and music and light. I want to ask you something, Alexander said, his silver eyes intense in the lamplight. And I want you to answer completely truthfully. Of course, she said, though her heart rate increased slightly. Do you care for me? He asked. Genuinely, beyond obligation or gratitude? Mira took a breath and decided to be braver than she'd ever been. Yes, she said. I do. I don't know if it's the kind of love that survives adversity or that transforms into something beautiful over decades. I don't know if it's the kind of love that conquers kingdoms or that makes the stars fall from the sky. But it's real and it's genuine and it's mine to give. Alexander pulled her closer, his hand on the small of her back burning through the fabric of her gown. That's all I've ever asked for, he said softly. The truth, whatever form it takes. I have another truth for you, Mira said. I'm terrified. Every single day. I'm terrified that this will all somehow disappear, that I'll wake up back in that cellar and realize this was all a dream. I know, he said, and I'm terrified that someday you'll look at me and see not a man, but a king, and you'll understand the full scope of the burden I carry, and you'll realize that you can't bear it. But we're staying anyway, she asked. We're staying anyway, he confirmed, because the best things in life require that kind of courage, and we've already proven we have it. They continued dancing as the night wore on, and Mira found herself thinking about the strange path that had brought her here. She'd entered this palace as an assassin, intended to be a weapon. Instead, she'd become something far more powerful. She'd become herself. Free, whole, and choosing to stand beside the Alpha King not because she had to, but because she wanted to. The darkness that had marked her entry into this world hadn't disappeared, but it had been transformed. She still carried the scars of her trauma, still had moments when fear threatened to overwhelm her, but those scars were becoming proof of her strength rather than evidence of her brokenness. And as she looked up at Alexander, at this complicated, powerful, dangerous man who'd chosen to be better than his nature demanded, she understood that love wasn't something that happened to you. It was something you built piece by piece, choice by choice, moment by moment. She'd built this with him, and whatever came next, she would build it again and again. The night deepened around them, and in the great hall of the palace where she'd once served in shadows, Mira danced in the light, finally home.